your headphones during a game, even outside your window in a movie theater speaker system, and your body barely registers it. That's strange when you think about it because that exact sound, in its earliest form, was invented by people who were terrified of dying and were trying to stop it from ever happening to them again. This is the story of how a search for immortality accidentally produced the most efficient killing machine humanity has ever built. Nobody set out to invent a weapon. It happened by accident, then by mistake, then by a series of increasingly desperate fixes to problems nobody saw coming. And it started with a bowl, a court alchemist, and an emperor who was terrified of dying. Picture the scene. You're in China more than 1,000 years ago, and you hold one of the strangest job titles in history, court alchemist, half chemist, half mystic, fully employed by an emperor who is paying enormous sums of gold for one specific outcome. He does not want more territory. He does not want more soldiers. He wants to never die. And you, along with dozens of other alchemists across the empire, are racing to be the one who finally cracks it. This wasn't some fringe superstition confined to a handful of eccentrics. The pursuit of immortality was arguably the largest funded research effort on the planet at the time, and the emperors weren't watching from a safe distance. When their alchemists produced a new formula, the emperors drank it themselves. This turned out to be a spectacularly bad decision, because many of these formulas were loaded with mercury and arsenic. Multiple Chinese emperors are documented to have died from the very potions meant to make them immortal. Long before gunpowder ever killed a single soldier, the search for eternal life was already quietly racking up a body count of its own. Now back to your workshop. Today you're testing something new, a yellow mineral ground fine, some charred wood, and a strange white crust you scraped off the wall of a damp cellar. You mix the three together in a bowl and lean in to check the color and texture the way you've done 100 times before. This time the bowl detonates in your face. Your hands are burned, your eyebrows are gone, the workshop is on fire around you, and in this moment of pain and shock you have accidentally discovered something no one on Earth understands yet, a chemical mixture that doesn't need outside air to burn. That single invisible property is going to reshape the next 1,000 years of human history, and you have no idea. Let's pause and actually break down what just happened, because it explains everything that follows. The yellow mineral was sulfur, a substance already used at the time to treat skin conditions. The charred wood was simple charcoal, and that strange white crust, the one that made the difference, was saltpeter, a mineral that forms naturally wherever nitrogen-rich waste breaks down: cave floors, old cellars, manure piles. In blunt terms, one of the essential ingredients behind every gun ever built is a substance that quite literally crystallizes out of animal urine. Here's why that mattered chemically. An ordinary fire has to constantly draw oxygen from the surrounding air to keep burning, which is why a campfire burns slowly, log by log, over hours. Saltpeter breaks that rule entirely. It holds its own oxygen locked inside its molecular structure, so a mixture containing it doesn't need to wait for air to reach it. It ignites and consumes itself almost instantly, releasing an enormous burst of hot expanding gas all at once. Out in the open air, that burst is nothing more than a flash and a bang, dramatic but harmless. Seal that same burst of gas inside something with solid walls, however, and the expanding gas has nowhere to escape except violently, through the weakest point available. That single fact, contained oxygen plus a sealed tube, is the entire mechanical principle behind every firearm that has ever existed. We actually have written proof these accidental explosions were happening constantly, because around the 9th century, a Chinese text finally described the phenomenon in detail, not as an instruction manual, but as a warning to other alchemists. It documented burned hands, burned faces, and buildings reduced to ash. In other words, the very first written record of gunpowder in human history reads less like a discovery and more like someone begging their colleagues to stop blowing themselves up. The name given to this new substance tells you exactly how its inventors understood it. Not a powder, not a weapon. They called it huo yao, fire medicine, because as far as anyone knew, this was still a branch of the same immortality research they'd been pursuing all along. It simply needed a bit more refinement before it would work properly. One of history's most devastating inventions spent its first 2 centuries of existence sitting quietly in the medicine cabinet, used mostly for fireworks, signal flares, and decorative flaming arrows. It was, for the most part, harmless. Then a siege happened, and everything changed. In the year 1132, defenders inside a besieged Chinese city carried something onto the walls that had never existed before. A long wooden spear with a bamboo tube lashed near the tip, packed with fire medicine. Put yourself in that defender's position. An enemy soldier is scaling a ladder directly towards you. You lower the spear, touch a flame to a fuse near the tube, and a roaring jet of fire erupts outwards straight into the attacker's face. This weapon became known as the fire lance, essentially a disposable flamethrower on a stick, burning for only a handful of seconds before it was spent. But for those few seconds, whoever held it wielded something that must have felt genuinely supernatural. Here's where the design took an unplanned turn. Soldiers began stuffing scrap material into the tubes alongside the powder charge, broken pottery shards, bits of scrap iron, small stones, anything that might make the resulting fireball more destructive. But after examining wounded enemy soldiers following a battle, someone noticed something unexpected. The flame itself barely traveled a few feet. The scrap material, however, flew much farther and drove deep into human flesh. The junk was doing more damage than the fire ever had. Over the following decades, the entire purpose of the weapon quietly reversed itself. The flame became an afterthought. The debris flying out of the tube became the actual weapon. Nobody sat in a workshop and deliberately invented the bullet. The bullet was, quite literally, garbage that happened to work better than fire, but wealthy nobility. It was an elegant solution that virtually no army on Earth could afford to mass produce. The affordable answer arrived roughly a century later, engineered by a French gunmaker working under royal patronage. His solution was almost insultingly simple by comparison. Clamp a small piece of flint into a spring-loaded arm, pull the trigger and the flint snaps forward, scrapes hard against a steel-striking plate, and sends sparks directly into the powder. This became known as the flintlock, cheap to manufacture, mechanically rugged, and dependable in a way none of its predecessors had been. It remained the standard firearm across the entire world for roughly 200 years, carried by soldiers in revolutions and empires alike. But there's a critical weakness from those 2 centuries that rarely gets mentioned, and it single-handedly dictated the shape of every major battle fought during that era: reloading. Firing a single shot required a soldier to stand completely upright, pour a measured charge of powder down the muzzle, ram a lead ball down after it using a long rod, prime the ignition pan, and cock the mechanism. Even for a well-drilled soldier working quickly under pressure, this entire process consumed roughly 20 seconds. 20 seconds spent standing fully exposed while an enemy charged with bayonets fixed. This single flaw explains why historical battle formations look so bizarre to modern eyes. Long, rigid lines of men standing upright in open fields, firing in synchronized volleys. This wasn't recklessness, it was survival strategy. One row fired while the row behind them stood ready, then the two swapped positions and repeated the cycle. The entire battlefield formation of an era existed purely to compensate for those 20 defenseless seconds. The person who finally solved this particular flaw wasn't a military engineer or a general. He was a Scottish clergyman, and his motivation had nothing to do with warfare at all. He simply loved duck hunting, and his flintlock kept sabotaging him out in the marshes. Every time he pulled the trigger, the priming powder ignited first in a small bright flash, and only a fraction of a second later did the main charge actually fire. Ducks, understandably, noticed that flash and took off before the shot ever reached them. This happened to him repeatedly, hunt after failed hunt. So in 1807, this frustrated bird hunter patented an entirely new chemical compound, one that required no external spark whatsoever. It detonated the instant it was struck with the slightest physical force. Ignition became instantaneous, fully sealed, and completely waterproof. eliminating flash delay and misfires caused by damp powder in one stroke. Rain had been undermining firearms for roughly 6 centuries at that point, and it finally lost because a country minister's ducks kept diving for cover a split second too early. From there, the final evolutionary step followed almost naturally. By the 1860s, gunmakers combined everything a single shot required, the striking compound, the propellant powder, and the bullet itself, into one compact brass casing, the modern cartridge. Loading a firearm collapsed from a 20-second multi-step ritual down to a single 1-second motion. And once loading became nearly instantaneous, cartridges could be stacked together and fed automatically through a magazine, firing one after another in rapid succession. The revolver, the repeating rifle, the modern semi-automatic pistol, virtually every firearm manufactured since then is simply a faster, more refined method of feeding that same brass casing into that same fundamental metal tube first cast in bronze centuries earlier. So here's the actual arc of this story, laid out end to end. A group of people terrified of dying accidentally created a chemical mixture that carries its own oxygen supply, and in their confusion they filed it away as medicine. Soldiers eventually strapped that mixture to spears and built improvised flamethrowers. The scrap material they packed alongside it turned out to be deadlier than the fire itself, so the projectile quietly took over as the actual weapon. Bamboo couldn't handle the pressure, so engineers recast the tube in bronze. That bronze tube grew into siege cannons capable of ending thousand-year-old fortifications, then shrank back down into something a single soldier could carry, and every miniaturized version introduced a brand new problem. You couldn't aim it, so came a mechanical trigger. Rain kept killing the ignition source, so came a self-sparking mechanism. That mechanism was too expensive for ordinary armies, so came a cheaper, simpler design. Reloading left soldiers exposed for 20 fatal seconds, so a duck hunter's frustration produced instant chemical ignition. And a small brass case tied every remaining piece together into the weapon we'd recognize today. Nobody planned any single step of this. It unfolded over roughly 1,000 years, driven by an exploding workshop, burst bamboo tubes, collapsing city walls, rain-soaked ignition cords, and one deeply annoyed bird hunter, each accidental fix solving exactly one flaw while quietly creating the next weapon in line. And now, here's where it landed. You'll hear that exact sound again tonight, in a film, a show, a game, and it will cost you nothing, not even a flinch of recognition. But every single gunshot you have ever heard, whether real or reproduced through a speaker, traces its chemical origin back to the same reaction that detonated inside a frightened alchemist's bowl more than 1,000 years ago. Fire medicine, finally sealed inside a metal tube. The people who started this chain of events were trying to outrun death entirely. Instead, they handed death one of the most efficient tools it has ever been given. And somewhere on this planet, in the next 2 minutes, another one is about to go off.